People always imagine danger as something loud. A scream, a struggle, a warning you can feel in your chest. But the truth is, the moments that change everything often happen quietly, in the space between footsteps, when no one is watching. If you're listening to this right now, stay with me, because what happened to Katie Sepich on that warm New Mexico night is the kind of story that reminds you how fast a life can pivot. How a single decision, a single turn in the dark, can open the door to tragedy. And if stories like this matter to you, if you believe in shining a light on cases where justice had to fight its way to the surface, make sure you follow and stay all the way through, because this case does not begin where you think it does, and it definitely does not end where anyone expected. It started on August 31st, 2003. A late summer night still clinging to the heat of the day. The kind of night where the desert air tastes like dust and electricity. Las Cruces doesn't look dangerous. Not on the surface. Students walked home from parties all the time, laughing, barefoot, distracted, safe in the assumption that danger belonged somewhere else. And that night, 22-year-old grad student Katie Sepich was one of them. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't the type to put herself in harm's way. She was just a tired young woman walking home, carrying her shoes in her hand after leaving a small gathering. People who knew her would later say Katie wasn't the kind of person you could sum up in a single trait. She was bright but humble, focused but warm, responsible but never boring. She was the kind of person who listened when others talked, who remembered small things about people, who worked hard in a way that made it look easy. She was in her first semester of an MBA program at New Mexico State University, pushing herself toward a future she hadn't fully mapped out yet, but one she knew she'd earn. She was close to her parents, close to her friends, the kind of daughter who called home often, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. That night, she'd gotten into a small argument with her boyfriend. Nothing explosive. Nothing anyone would look back on and say, that was a sign. It was normal. Just human. After the argument, she decided to walk the short distance home to cool off. Alone, but only for a couple blocks. Only through familiar, well-lit streets she'd walked dozens of times before. But people forget how quickly the ordinary can turn. They forget how, in the quiet spaces between houses, in the patches of shadow between streetlights, someone can be waiting. Someone with intent. Someone who doesn't belong to the rhythm of the night but slips into it like a predator into high grass. At some point on that walk, Katie crossed paths with the last person she ever expected to meet. And everything that happened next, the disappearance, the violence, the silence afterward, unfolded in shadows no one saw. The next morning, as the sun rose over the desert, a passerby noticed something strange off a dirt road outside the city. A shape, a form that didn't blend with the sand and brush. It was Katie. News didn't spread slowly. It hit the campus like a shockwave. Students woke up to whispers, rumors, flashes of panic. Katie? No, that couldn't be right. She was responsible, loved, focused, alive. People tried to make sense of it, but there was nothing sensible about what they were hearing. Her parents, Jan and Dave, were in Carlsbad when the phone rang. And no matter how many stories you hear, no matter how many times you imagine the worst, nothing prepares you for the real thing. For that one sentence that slices your life in half. They rushed to Las Cruces, clinging to the kind of hope that isn't hope at all, it's denial wearing a mask. The investigation began immediately. Detectives traced Katie's last moments, calling friends, mapping her steps, searching for surveillance footage that didn't exist in that neighborhood in 2003. They collected DNA, clothing fibers, footprints, anything the desert hadn't swallowed. But investigations don't move the way movies show you. They don't explode into revelations and confessions overnight. Most of the time, they're quiet, methodical, painfully slow. And this one was slow. The DNA turned up nothing. No match. No suspect. No one with a connection to Katie. Everyone who knew her was accounted for. Everyone close to her passed their interviews. Every lead evaporated. For the first few weeks, Las Cruces walked around holding its breath. Students looked over their shoulders. Parents called their kids more often. Reporters tried to make sense of a case that had no center, no anchor. And detectives tried to keep the pressure up, because the clock was ticking in ways that only investigators truly understand. For Katie's parents, the days blurred into each other. There was grief, of course. Grief so raw it didn't feel like crying but like drowning. But there was also fear, because something unspoken hung in every room, in every meeting with detectives. The person who did this was still out there, living their life, walking free. The first month passed, then the second, then the fifth. Tips came in, but none of them mattered. False sightings, rumors, stories that fell apart under 5 minutes of scrutiny. Every dead end tightened the knot in Jan and Dave's stomachs. They couldn't bring their daughter back, but they couldn't move forward either. It felt like being trapped in a moment you cannot escape. By the 1-year mark, the investigation was no closer to an answer than it had been the morning Katie was found. The case remained open, but time had started working against them. Cases don't technically go cold at 1 year, but emotionally, publicly, practically, it can feel that way. And Katie deserved more than that. Every victim does, but especially someone like Katie, whose life was built on kindness, focus, and purpose. Her parents stood in front of cameras that anniversary and talked about their daughter. They talked about the kind of person she was. They talked about the future she deserved. They talked about the hole she left behind. And behind their grief was something else, resolve. A determination that bordered on fierce. Because even if the investigation had stalled, even if they didn't know what the path forward looked like, they were not done. They refused to let the world forget her name. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that the answer to Katie's case was sitting quietly in the future. That 3 years after her murder, a different crime, a different arrest, and a single swab of DNA would rip open the silence and expose the truth. That the person who took her life had not disappeared into the night at all. He was living in that same community, untouched, unnoticed, until one small moment of accountability forced his DNA into a system that should have caught him much earlier. But all of that was still years away. For now, the world had gone quiet around the name Katie Sepich. Too quiet. And in that silence, her parents began to feel a shift. Not away from grief, but into something stronger. A sense that if the system wasn't designed to catch men like the one who murdered their daughter, then maybe the system itself needed to change. That belief, still fragile then, was about to grow into something much bigger. Something national. Something that would reshape criminal justice across the country. Something that would save lives. But that part of the story is still ahead. For most people, grief either freezes them or pushes them into motion. For Katie's parents, it did both. Some mornings, the weight of what happened felt impossible to carry. Other mornings, they woke up with an almost physical need to push forward, to refuse the silence settling around the investigation. They didn't want to become those parents you see in documentaries. Exhausted, defeated, sitting in living rooms lined with fading photographs, waiting for a phone call that never comes. They wanted progress, answers, something, anything, that proved the world hadn't simply moved on without their daughter. But the months kept slipping by, and nothing moved. Detectives still worked the case, but without a suspect or a new lead, even the best investigators hit walls. Records were reviewed, interviews rechecked, maps studied again and again as if some overlooked clue might suddenly materialize. But you can only circle the same dead ends so many times before the pattern becomes painful. The Sepiches began doing something many families of victims eventually learned to do. They became investigators themselves. Not formally, not in a way that interfered with the case, but in the quiet corners of their home, they built timelines, reviewed every detail the police could legally share, and pushed their minds into places no parent ever wants to go. They wanted to understand who could have done this. How someone could commit a crime so violent and then simply evaporate into the fabric of daily life. Friends tried to support them, but grief creates a kind of distance. People don't know how to talk to you. They worry every sentence is the wrong one. Invitations fade. Normal conversations feel impossible. And slowly, the Sepiches found themselves moving in a smaller circle, one that included investigators, a handful of close friends, and their own determination. Behind all of it was one question. Who? Theories popped up here and there. Random violence. A stranger passing through town. Someone who saw her leave the gathering. A person with a history of aggression. But with no DNA match in any database, every theory was just that, a guess. Sometimes guesses are enough to guide a case forward. But not this one. Whoever did this left no trail the system could follow. Years have a strange way of slipping by when you're waiting for something. They move slowly day to day, but when you look back, it feels like they disappeared in a blink. By 2006, nearly 3 years had passed. 3 years of birthdays without her. 3 years of holidays with an empty chair. 3 years of waiting for a name. And then something happened, something small, something that didn't even involve the Sepich family at first. In fact, no one realized its significance when it occurred. It began with a different crime entirely. In early 2006, local police arrested a man in Las Cruces for a domestic violence incident. His name was Gabriel Avila. He wasn't arrested for anything extreme, nothing that would make headlines outside his neighborhood. But under New Mexico law at the time, DNA was not automatically collected from arrestees unless it was a qualifying offense. Domestic violence wasn't always included. The rules varied. The enforcement varied even more. And in many cases, samples slipped through the cracks entirely. But this one time, a DNA sample was taken. It was a decision that should have been standard. It wasn't, but it happened. The sample was processed and eventually entered into the system. Nothing dramatic. No immediate alarms. Just another piece of genetic information stored away. And then the computers made a connection. Partial match. Strong. Unmistakable. Linked directly to the biological evidence collected from the desert near Las Cruces in 2003. When detectives received that alert, the room changed. Cases like Katie's don't just pop after years of nothing. Detectives don't get to feel relief often. But that day, they felt it. A name. A real name. Person. Someone they could see, question, confront. They reviewed records, pulled files, reconstructed the timeline of Avila's life in 2003. He wasn't a shadowy drifter. He wasn't a ghost. He lived in the same community. He had a job, a routine, a life that existed right alongside the Sepiches, the students, the neighbors, the investigators. Detectives moved carefully. You don't rush when the truth is finally within reach. They gathered additional evidence, checked for errors, made sure this wasn't a misread or contamination or anything that could collapse the case later. And when they were certain, they brought him in. Interrogations don't usually go the way people imagine. There's no dramatic slamming of fists. No theatrical confessions straight out of a crime show. Sometimes suspects talk. Sometimes they deny. Sometimes they crack under pressure or say something small that gives everything away. What stunned detectives wasn't the confession itself. It was the casualness of it. Avila eventually admitted to attacking Katie, to being there that night, to crossing paths with her. But there was no story of remorse, no explanation that made sense of the senseless. It was an admission delivered without weight, as if saying the words was no more significant than commenting on the weather. When authorities told the Sepich family they had identified a suspect, the moment didn't feel like closure. It didn't feel like victory. It felt surreal. After almost 3 years of staring into the unknown, they suddenly had a name, one they had never heard before. A stranger. When they learned he had been living freely in their own community all that time, the shock deepened. The idea that the person who took their daughter's life had been walking around, working, eating, sleeping, moving through ordinary days with no consequence. It made their stomachs turn. But shock was quickly replaced by a different emotion. Anger. Not the kind that lashes out, but the kind that focuses. The kind that points itself at a system that allowed someone like this to slip through until fate, not policy, finally caught up with him. Because here was the chilling truth. If that domestic violence arrest had never happened, or if DNA hadn't been collected during it, Katie's case might still be unsolved today. Her killer might still be anonymous. And that realization shifted something inside her parents. The system wasn't broken because detectives failed. The system was broken because it wasn't built to catch men like Avila until they committed multiple crimes, until someone else suffered. Katie's case wasn't solved by design. It was solved by coincidence. And the Sepiches couldn't accept that. They started asking questions, the kind of questions people don't always want to hear. Why wasn't DNA collected from all felony arrestees? Why was a tool capable of identifying violent offenders sitting behind red tape? How many criminals were slipping through gaps that shouldn't exist? And most importantly, how many victims could be saved if the rules changed? At first, these were private questions, conversations between grieving parents and investigators trying to be as transparent as they legally could. But soon, the questions grew larger. They took on a life of their own. The Sepiches realized the issue wasn't just Katie's case. It was statewide, national, systemic. They didn't want revenge. They wanted prevention. They wanted a world where someone like Avila would have been identified the first time he committed a crime, not after taking a life. They wanted a world where DNA wasn't treated as a last resort but as a first line of defense. They wanted to make sure their daughter's death didn't become another tragic story that sparked sympathy but no change. So they stepped into a role they never asked for: advocates. They began attending legislative meetings. They sat down with lawmakers, researchers, law enforcement leaders, anyone willing to listen. They learned how policies were made, how bills were written, how votes were secured or lost. They became experts in DNA collection laws because their daughter's life depended on it, even in death. Every room they entered felt heavy. Every conversation cost something emotionally, but they kept going. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't use theatrics. They used their story. They used Katie's name. And most importantly, they used the truth. And slowly, people started to listen. In New Mexico, the push for a new law began to build momentum. A law that would change everything. A law that would require DNA collection upon felony arrest, not conviction. A law designed to catch violent offenders before they escalated, before more lives were lost. A law that would eventually be called something both heartbreaking and powerful: Katie's Law. But the journey to make it real was only beginning. The first time the Sepiches walked into the New Mexico State Capitol building to speak about DNA laws, they didn't come in with political polish or polished speeches. They came in as parents. Parents carrying a photo of their daughter and a truth most people don't want to think about unless they're forced to. The truth that the gap between a safe world and a dangerous one is often nothing more than policy. Policy that either protects people or leaves them exposed. Most lawmakers had heard of Katie's case by then, but hearing it from her parents was different. It wasn't a headline. It wasn't a crime statistic. It was a story spoken in a quiet, steady voice by a mother whose life had been split open and rearranged into something unrecognizable. After one meeting, a representative would later say that hearing J.N. explain how close the case had come to remaining unsolved was the moment the air in the room changed. And that's what happened over and over throughout those early meetings. The air changed. Still, gaining support wasn't simple. Policy doesn't shift just because something is heartbreaking. The Sepiches quickly learned that changing any law, let alone one tied to criminal justice, meant facing questions, doubts, skepticism, and sometimes outright resistance. Some lawmakers worried about privacy. Some worried about cost. Some didn't want to attach themselves to any bill involving crime unless it was guaranteed to be popular. Others simply didn't understand the science. So the Sepiches learned. They learned the terminology. They learned the science. They learned how to explain the difference between collecting DNA from an arrestee and tracking their entire genetic makeup. They learned how to break complicated concepts into clear, undeniable logic. They learned, painfully, that if they wanted lawmakers to fight for Katie, they had to fight first. But for every obstacle, there were also people willing to listen. Detectives who supported it, prosecutors who urged lawmakers to see the bigger picture, and families of other victims who had gone through similar horrors. One father, whose daughter's killer was caught through a DNA match 7 years later, told the Sepiches, "If your law had existed then, my daughter might still be here." Statements like that fueled them. They weren't just trying to honor Katie. They were trying to keep the next family from living what they lived. As momentum built, the bill that would become Katie's Law began taking shape. It proposed something simple but powerful. Collect DNA from individuals arrested for certain felonies, analyze those samples quickly, and upload them into the national database. Not to invade privacy, not to track people, but to ensure that dangerous offenders did not slip into darkness after their first crime, only to reemerge when someone else became their victim. But even simple ideas can feel like mountains in politics. Hearings were long. Debates were tense. At one point, a committee member questioned whether collecting DNA on arrest would be too intrusive. J.N. looked him in the eye and said in a soft but steady voice, "What happened to my daughter was intrusive." The room fell into a silence so complete you could feel the shift. People listen differently when the truth hits them without warning. Some lawmakers were moved. Some were stunned. Some were uncomfortable. But none could deny the impact her words had. In the crowds at these hearings were everyday people. Students who had attended the same university as Katie, families who had lost loved ones to violent crimes, older neighbors who simply felt the world had become too unpredictable. Many came up to the Sepiches afterward. Some hugged them. Some whispered thank you. Some cried. And some admitted that they had never thought about DNA laws before but now understood why change was needed. But there was another truth running underneath all of this. The Sepiches were still grieving. They weren't activists by choice. They didn't wake up with speeches in their heads. They woke up missing their daughter. They woke up remembering the sound of her voice, the warmth of her presence, the plans she had for her life. Some days, speaking about her publicly felt like reopening the same wound again and again. Other days, it gave them purpose, a reason to keep moving forward instead of collapsing under the weight of their loss. And the closer the bill came to a vote, the more they felt that pressure. During those months, reporters often asked what motivated them, how they stayed strong. But they weren't strong in the way people imagine. They were determined, yes, but strength wasn't what fueled them, love was. Love for a daughter whose life had been taken, and love for people they would never meet but desperately wanted to protect. Finally, after months of testimony, revisions, negotiations, and emotional exhaustion, the bill went to a vote. The room was packed. Families, officers, journalists, legislators sitting stiffly behind desks covered in papers. Votes in legislative chambers move quickly, each name called in a steady rhythm. But for the Sepiches, it felt like time had slowed. Every yes felt like a step toward something bigger than justice for their daughter. Every no felt like a blow. When the final vote was tallied, the bill passed. Whispers spread across the chamber. People turned to look at the Sepiches. Some smiled. Some wiped their eyes. The governor later signed it into law, and with that signature, Katie's Law became real. New Mexico became one of the states leading the charge in modernizing DNA policy. Her parents had done the unthinkable. They had walked into their grief and turned it into protection for people they would never know. But what they didn't expect was what happened next. As news spread, other states took notice. Camera crews visited the Sepiches' home. National advocacy groups reached out. Lawmakers from across the country asked questions. Some invited the Sepiches to speak. They had never imagined their lives going in this direction. But they found themselves boarding flights, entering new legislative buildings, standing in new hearings, raising their daughter's photograph again and again. And each time something remarkable happened. People listened. State after state began drafting their own versions of Katie's Law. Some adopted it quickly. Others needed years. But the wave had started. And behind that wave was something that still feels almost unthinkable. One man's arrest for a domestic violence charge in 2006. A moment that could have meant nothing. A file that could have been lost. A procedure that could have been skipped, had instead become the spark that exposed a nationwide flaw. In the years that followed, the Sepiches met families whose lives had been changed because of the law. One woman told them her sister's killer was identified after 16 years because her state adopted a policy inspired by Katie's Law. A detective told them he had identified a serial offender in days rather than months. A governor once told J.N., "Your daughter has saved lives." Those words stayed with her. But even as their advocacy grew, the emotional cost didn't disappear. Grief doesn't soften just because purpose grows. Some nights, after long hearings, JN would sit in quiet hotel rooms and feel the weight of her daughter's absence more deeply than she had in years. Dave, usually the steadier one, sometimes found himself staring at the same photograph for minutes at a time, remembering the life that had been interrupted. And yet they kept going. They learned to navigate red tape. They learned to answer difficult questions with honesty. They learned to adapt their message to different states with different politics. They learned that change is possible, but only when people push for it without sitting down. Eventually, Katie's law, or a version of it, spread far beyond New Mexico, crossed state lines. It influenced federal initiatives. It became a national conversation. And through it all, the Sepiches carried their daughter's story the way someone might carry a flame. Carefully, protectively, determined not to let the wind extinguish it. But the forward momentum came with something else. Attention. Media attention. Public attention. And that attention brought them to a courtroom where they would finally confront the man whose actions had started everything. That moment was coming, and they were not ready for what it would feel like. It's strange how the world can look almost normal on the day everything finally breaks open. People walked their dogs. Students hurried to class. The desert wind carried that familiar dry whistle. And in the middle of all that ordinary life, a quiet phone call landed like a lightning strike. They had a match. The detective who answered felt it instantly. This wasn't just another update. This was the kind of call that sits in a cold case file for years like a dormant nerve, waiting for the right jolt. Lab results linked DNA from the scene to a man who, up until then, had barely brushed against the law. Not a murder suspect. Not a known predator. Someone who'd been arrested for a far less serious crime, the kind you'd expect to disappear in a county folder. A domestic violence charge. A moment of rage. And the mandatory DNA swab that came with it. A swab that connected him to something far darker than anyone around him ever suspected. The name hit the whiteboard in the briefing room with a thud that silenced the entire team. Gabriel Avila. He didn't know yet. He went about his day with the ease of a man who believed his secrets were buried deep in the desert, half a world away from consequence. But investigators were already moving toward him like a slow-building storm. They retraced his old addresses, his workplaces, his friends. They learned how he kept to himself, how he drifted, how he seemed to live in a haze of impulsive decisions and unexplained anger. When they finally arrived at his door, he looked confused, irritated even, but not afraid. That reaction stuck with the detectives. It always does. Monsters rarely see themselves in the mirror. They invited him to the station for a conversation, and he agreed. He probably thought it was a misunderstanding. Maybe he thought it was about the domestic case. Maybe he believed he was smarter than the law. But as he sat in that small room under fluorescent lights, something in his face twitched, just barely. When they placed the DNA results on the table. There are moments you can almost feel time folding inward. The air changes. The silence shifts. And in that room, something cracked in him. He didn't confess at first. Most don't. He insisted he had nothing to do with it, that he didn't even know her, that he'd never seen her. But DNA does not argue. It does not forget. It does not lie. The detectives watched him unravel slowly, like a rope fraying under its own weight. Hours passed. The walls felt closer. His breath grew shallow. His lies began to contradict each other, then contradict themselves. And eventually, after a long stretch of suffocating silence, he broke. The words came out uneven, rushed, almost whispered. He talked about that night, how he'd been wandering alone, how he'd seen her walking vulnerable, separated from the noise of the party, how impulse overrode humanity. He tried to downplay it at first, tried to paint himself as someone who lost control. But the detectives didn't let him hide inside that excuse. They pushed, and his story shifted, then shifted again. The truth leaked out in scattered pieces, ugly and incomplete, but unmistakable. When he finally fell quiet, the room itself felt contaminated by the truth. Word traveled fast. Investigators who had spent years staring at photographs, diagrams, timelines, maps, People who had carried this case like a weight they couldn't put down finally released a breath they barely realized they'd been holding. The arrest didn't bring joy. It didn't erase anything, but it anchored justice to a story that had floated in uncertainty for far too long. The trial didn't drag on for years. His own confession sealed most of it. The evidence filled in the rest. And when the sentence came, decades stacked on decades, it was heavy enough to ensure he'd never again see the world the way he had the night he followed her. But in the courtroom, there was something even heavier than the sentence. It was the presence of Katie's parents. They didn't scream. They didn't lash out. They didn't crumble. Their grief had already shaped itself into something unbreakable. They looked at the man who had taken their daughter's life, and instead of collapsing under the weight of it all, they began building something that would outlive him. Justice wasn't the end for them. It was the beginning of something bigger. In the days that followed, they learned about the timing of the DNA match, how it never would have happened if his sample hadn't been taken during that unrelated arrest, how countless other families had cases just like theirs, stalled in limbo, waiting for a match that could only be made if the right laws existed. That realization hit harder than any verdict. They could not save Katie, but they could save someone else. It was a thought that grew quietly at first, then louder, then unstoppable. What if DNA wasn't collected so late? What if violent offenders were identified before they escalated? What if the system didn't depend on chance and timing, but on structure and protection? Her parents heard story after story from other families, cases uncannily similar, chillingly preventable, all hanging on one missing piece: early DNA collection. Their grief sharpened into purpose. While the world around them resumed its normal pace, they stepped into a new role. Advocates, reformers, voices for victims who had never been heard. They walked into legislative halls still trembling from the weight of loss, yet spoke with the clarity of people who had nothing left to fear. And in those dimly lit rooms full of lawmakers and policy advisors, they repeated the same message over and over. If this law had existed earlier, our daughter would be alive. The sentence always hung in the air like a held breath. Lawmakers listened. Some pushed back. Some wanted data. Some wanted time. But grief backed by truth has a force that's almost impossible to ignore. Slowly, then suddenly legislation began to shift. And through that movement, through each signature and revision and vote, Katie's story transformed into something far larger than her tragic final moments. It became a catalyst, a shield, a turning point in the way justice is carried out. All because one family refused to let her disappear into a file folder. If Katie's story moved you even for a moment, don't let it end when this video does. Her parents turned their pain into protection for countless others, and you can help keep that legacy alive just by pressing one button. Like the video so more people discover her story. Subscribe so you never miss the cases that still need voices, and share this with someone who believes justice shouldn't depend on luck. Your engagement isn't just support for the channel. It's a way of making sure stories like Katie's are never forgotten, and that the next family waiting for answers doesn't wait alone.